You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show, where today we are doing something I swore I would never do. Something I promised the listeners we'd never do. I'm having a Canadian on the show. I go into it a little bit with William to explain it, but if you're new here, this show's 13 years old. That's how old this podcast has been going. It was called We Are Libertarians for a long time. Really, like half the time We Are Libertarians, half the time it's been the Chris Spangle Show. And back in the day, we did a lot more jokes, a lot more irreverent. I'm trying to be an upstanding member of society, so I can't be as much as a misfit as I used to be. But there's like 800 episodes in this free feed. And then there is a private feed for Patreon members where you can go back and listen to all the past 1,500 episodes. So that's how much content there is that isn't out there, largely because of these jokes. But in the early days, the reason I podcast is because of a podcast called The Mike O'Mara Show. Radio guys who went into podcasting, and it inspired me to start We Are Libertarians back in 2012. And there was a recurring joke that they had on that podcast. They still do the podcast, but back then they made jokes about America's hat and how Canada was the great white menace of the North. And I blatantly ripped that off as a way to illustrate the foolishness of making other countries your enemy, and made a lot of jokes at the expense of Canada. That was where the Dear Leader thing came in. People used to call me Dear Leader because on episode 30, we're on this is like 1497 of the podcasts. But back on episode 30, 33, I had to fire one of our founding co-hosts because he hit another co-host. It's just crazy back then. God bless Chris Galt and Creighton Harrington. They're both doing really well in life. But I said, look, I'm Dear Leader. I'm the dictator of this. And that spawned a decade of Dear Leader jokes. But I adopted that personality to kind of show you the authoritarian personality and the inherent conflicts of that. And I feel like I probably should bring that back. But having lived through that the last 10 years, it's not as funny to me. But the Canadian thing was a way to just sort of illustrate to you how stupid it is that we hate Iranians because our government says so, or how we hate the Chinese because our government says so. I certainly think we should hate the Chinese government, but it's sort of foolish to take a look at Canada, who has a culture like ours, a government loosely like ours, values and principles that are basically like ours, and dislike them. I never thought I would live to see a politician take my joke and actually turn it into policy. I never thought I'd see a person take the Dear Leader personality and make it their personality. I was just ahead of the curve, man. And if I had been serious, think about how far I'd be instead of just having actually been joking. But I wanted, I got this article sent to me from our friends at Young Voices by a guy named William Dunstan. He's a Young Voices contributor, master of public policy student at University of Calgary. And he works with a lot of different Canadian think tanks. And they sent me this article about the Ontario Liberals and NDP misunderstood what young people need. And it's about an election in Ontario. And as I told William off here, it's not that I don't care about the election in Ontario. I do, because a lot of the points he makes in this article are very resonant with people who live in blue areas like I do. I have a literal socialist for a city councilor here in the 12th largest city where I live. That's how deep blue in Indiana I am a red state. I like that. I like being in the red state with the blue city. I like that juxtaposition. I think you would understand. But I wanted to have William on to talk about Canadian politics, how they're reacting to American politics, and where are we at in terms of our relationship? Just maybe do a check-in. Are we in a situationship? Right? Are things going? Do you really hate us? And the answer was yes. So William kind of details where the Canadian people are, and they're in the middle of an election, and the Liberals probably going to win instead of the very impressive Conservative who I follow on Twitter and love all of his speeches because he seems like a bit of a Canadian Reagan, and he's unfortunately not going to win because of Donald Trump. So he kind of fills us in on all this and why that's happening and explains the basics of Canadian politics and economics. So it's a really interesting conversation. So instead of me droning on, let's get right to it. Here is William Dunstan. William, thanks so much for being my guest.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Now, William, I have to be honest. You're the first Canadian we've ever had on the show, and the show is 13 years old.
Oh, wow. What an honor.
Yes, quite an honor, because I used to have a bit on the show here where I would kind of illustrate how foolish aggression towards other nations can be. And I used Canada as an example because, let's face it, you're the great white menace of the North, and 98% of you are living on the border, and we need to know why. And Mike Myers and these other Canadians are just Martin Short. They're all spies, aren't they? And these geese, enough with the geese. So that was kind of the bit. So that's I've at some point maybe I internalized it, but now I don't want you to be our 51st state because of all that. How do you? So that's kind of a silly introduction, but to ask you, what are the Canadian people thinking about the whole 51st state thing and Trump wanting you to join America? And he took my bit and turned it into reality, and it's very, very weird.
Yeah, so there's a lot you can say about that. I will say most Canadians are taking it pretty negatively, that mix of one, you have the tariff threats, which are now materializing, and it's unclear how much more will materialize with Trump shifting on the exact tariff policy every day. And then the 51st state remarks are also concerning. So, yeah, to give that Canadian perspective, so Canadians have always been generally favorable to the United States. We see them as a key economic ally, a key military ally, a key friend in a sometimes chaotic world. And there's generally been positivity to the United States. There's been, within Canada's political culture, there's a little bit of an undercurrent of anti-Americanism where Canadian nationalism takes this strange form of not necessarily being, proud of something Canadian, but being proud and not being American. That's a lot of how Canada has defined its national identity over the past 50 years. So
that's
Canadians,
weird because we have that same thing here too. We don't want to be Americans half the time.
Yeah, so like a really good example would be healthcare in Canada. A lot of Canadians are really proud of the public healthcare system. I think just because it's something that's a very obvious distinction with the United States. But when I say there's an undercurrent of anti-American nationalism, it's really never been hostility or negativity to the United States. It was just a desire for difference. And then over the past few months with Trump's tariff actions, with the 51st state jokes, that it's not clear how much they're really a joke.
They're not jokes.
Yeah, there has been a real negative turn to the United States, and you're starting to see a real desire among Canadians to have our military be less reliant on the United States, to have less cooperation with the U.S. to start to weaken those economic ties. Because Canadians didn't want this tariff war. They wanted to have strong, good relationships with the United States. But now that this has come, there's a lot of, if you don't know, we're in the federal election right now. And there's a lot of pressure on the candidates to basically show and prove how strong they're going to be in fighting Trump and how much they're going to fight back against the United States. And I think that's really damaging for a long-term relationship between Canada and the US.
Yeah, because that's one question that I have for you. Is it like the freedom fries in France? And like Americans make a lot of jokes about the French and waving the white flag and not wearing deodorant and that kind of thing. But like we really do appreciate the French. We're a country because of the French. And I think Americans generally feel a common cause with the French in a lot of ways. But it's sort of like when we went through the Iraq war stuff, it was freedom fries and we're not going to call the French. And it was just sort of like a moment thing, right? It wasn't a long lasting, deep seated thing that, that kind of turns into bitterness. So when we see the American flag being booed at hockey and basketball games and some of this stuff, do you think it is part of that fervor and that'll die down once Trump's off the scene? This all kind of go back to homeostasis? Or do you think that what's happening with the president is so damaging between the relationships that it could have real, actual structural impact?
Yeah, I think this is different. And I'd say it's even different from the first Trump term. In the first term of the Trump presidency, he was, somewhat, bashful and a bit rude to allies, but he really didn't do all that much to damage the relationship. There were some modest tariffs brought in. There were some demands, which I think were to an extent fair, that Canada, European countries, and other NATO allies spend more on their military. But that was really more of a temporary thing. What you're seeing from Trump now, just this constant hostile rhetoric towards Canada, towards Europe, towards other American allies. I think that's led Canadians and I think other international allies of the US to really feel that the US is no longer a stable partner, that's a country they can't trust in military alliances, in trade relationships. So I hope that this is a conflict that can be resolved and then either a policy reversal from Trump, or after Trump leaves office, you can have a repair of that relationship. But I would say this is different and worse than some of the previous strains you've seen between the US and its allies.
Yeah, I mean, Canada has tariffs on us, and this is sort of the justification for all of this is that, well, Canada has like 200% tariffs on this item and that item. And so therefore the broader trade war is justified. And it's like, well, if you're really saying tariffs are a bad thing, and so us doing a bad thing back doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And, here in Indiana, I mean, if you look at the state by state trading partner for most states, Canada's one or two, right? We are very intricately aligned in terms of economic trade in a lot of ways. And I think what happens is you sort of see like the liquor being taken off the shelves and we're only going to drink Canadian. And I always kind of, and in the American press watching it go, all right, yeah, but this is like a thing that people can easily grasp onto. When it comes to the economy there, are you feeling effects of the tariffs, of this like 3-month war that has kind of kicked off? And what is the economic situation there more generally?
Yeah, so there definitely has been real economic impacts. There's been some of that, consumers choosing to buy Canadian instead of American, but there has been a real impact on business and investment. It's hard to quantify exactly how much investment hasn't been made that would have been made, because that's a counterfactual, but that's definitely something you're hearing from business leaders. I saw within the past couple days, Stellantis, one of their assembly plants in Southern Ontario, was shut down temporarily with the announcement of new tariffs on auto parts. So we'll see how long that lasts. There's definitely been a negative impact in Canada. It's likely going to be, in terms of total economic impact, more negative for Canada than the United States, just because trade with the US is a much larger share of our economy than trade with Canada is a share of your economy, just because of the relative size. We're 10 times smaller. But at the same time, I think what you're seeing in the US is still a very negative impact on US consumers, because that's what tariffs are, right? Let's be honest, they're a tax on imports into the United States. So it's a tax on whatever you're importing, whether that's agricultural goods, whether that's auto parts, whatever it is, it's a tax on US consumers.
Yeah, the other thing is, and I'm not going to say his last name right, but I have watched Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition in Canada, more conservative guy. He has, and I don't know your politics enough, your personal politics or Canadian politics to have like, I don't know if there's a Canadian Libertarian Party and you're a part of it, or if you like, if it's just like a two-party system there, or kind of how that all. We're going to have a primer here in just a minute on Canadian politics. But the other aspect, finishing up with Trump, is Pierre Poilievre seems pretty conservative, pretty Reagan-esque, pretty impressive in a lot of ways, especially when juxtaposed with Justin Trudeau, who's fairly statist. And he was probably going to be your prime minister, and you probably would have had more conservative free market policies being introduced into Canadian politics. And then now it's plummeted, and Justin Trudeau had this, like, there's a chart where he just plummets and the Liberal candidate just skyrockets. And this is sort of the real Trump legacy, is that everything that he intends sort of goes the other direction. Can you talk about the reaction in the political system? Because I saw the Liberal candidate the other day giving a war speech against Americans.
Yeah.
It was like the South Park movie. It was, I mean, what is the environment right there in the middle of your election?
Yeah, so to give a quick primer on the Canadian political landscape broadly. So we have two large national political parties, which are the only two parties that ever win the national elections. And those are the Conservative Party that you've just described, currently led by Pierre Poilievre. It's our our main right-wing political party. Its philosophy is definitely more freedom, conservative, Reagan-esque than the more nationalist, Trumpian style of conservatism you're seeing from Republicans in the United States right now. We also have the Liberal Party, which was the party Justin Trudeau led and have been in power for the past 10 years and is now led by Mark Carney. That is a vaguely center to center left party. Sometimes it goes more to the left like it did under Trudeau. Carney seems to be taking it a bit more to the center. We also have a few other minor parties. So we have the NDP, which is a democratic socialist party. There's also in the French-speaking province of Quebec, you have the Bloc Québécois, which is a vaguely Quebec interests party, somewhat socialist party. And then you have smatterings of other minor parties. We don't really have a libertarian party. There's a very minor party called the Libertarian Party that has never won a seat in parliament. You have the People's Party, which was founded by Maxime Bernier, who was originally a libertarian and narrowly lost the conservative leadership. And now he's more gone in a mix of libertarianism and nationalist conservatism. And the People's Party is also
Let me introduce you to our Libertarian Party.
Yeah. Now they're polling around 2-3%. They're not a big factor. Yeah, and like you said, for the past couple of years, since around 2023, Canadians have, the Conservatives have been leading very well in the polls. They were on track comfortably to win a big majority government, largely due to concerns about affordability, the cost of living, the cost of housing, just a feeling that the Trudeau Liberals were not delivering on those issues and on economic growth. And now what we've seen in the past few months is, since the Trump threat has came in, it's upended the political landscape. Back in December or January, the big issue sets, the issues Canadians were going to be voting on in the next election were affordability, housing, economic growth. Now it's about how do you respond to that threat from Donald Trump of damaging the economic relationship with the United States, forcing Canada to be more independent on defense. So you have, like you were talking about, Mark Carney giving a war style speech. And it's not quite that extreme, but it's close, right? Like, Canadian politicians are in this election talking about, we need to make sure that our military is stronger and we can defend ourselves because we can't rely on the US. We need to bring in reciprocal tariffs. I'm not sure how good of an idea those are, but the dominant idea is they want reciprocal tariffs to fight against the US. And that's definitely what the political landscape is. And that's played into the hands of the Liberal Party. And that relates back to something I said a bit earlier about like anti-American Canadian identity. That's really something the Liberals have historically played up. Canada's a bit unique in countries around the world in that it's really our left-wing and center-left parties that benefit from spurts of Canadian nationalism. In most countries, nationalism is like it's typically a right-wing political phenomenon. In Canada, it's the center-left party that do a really good job of distinguishing themselves from the political culture in the United States that tend to benefit when there's a spurt of Canadian nationalism or concerns about the United States. And that's what you're seeing with Mark Carney and the Liberals right now. So, yeah, it looks like Trump's actions have completely cost the Conservatives the election here in Canada, and likely will, and we're going to have another 4 years of Liberal leadership. It will, fortunately, probably be closer to the center than it was under Trudeau, but it is another 4 years of Liberal leadership likely.
Yeah, it's going to rein in some of the excesses, but it's not going to go in the direction that I think a lot of our listeners would want. So, where to take this? Let's talk about your article. Okay, so you wrote an op-ed. The Ontario Liberals and NDP misunderstood what young people need. So, was there a local election? So this is in the Juno News. It'll be in the show notes. You can check it out. But I want to get into some of the more granular issues of Canadian politics and what is appealing to your average Canadian, and why basically Trudeau-style liberalism isn't working for young people. Because I think this is something we see in America. There is a shift rightward. I was listening to Howard Stern yesterday, and I was thinking, like, how different Howard Stern is now versus 2006, and how different my tastes are. Like, I don't want, like, things come on TikTok, and I'm like, I don't want to see this, right? Like, I think as you get older, you get more conservative. You get more concerned with your retirement. You get more concerned about the environment and culture and that the kids are growing up in, right? Like, and Canadians exist in this place where they're offered a lot of free stuff, right? And that is what I got out of your article, is that a lot of the free stuff that is being offered by the Liberal Party in these elections is not landing with young people, which is like the golden cat. I've never understood why are we going for young people? They don't vote. They're not reliable. They can't fund your campaign, right? But everybody wants to capture the youth for their product or vote. What are Liberals promising in general to young people that isn't working for them?
Yeah, so I think really what it's been in Canada lately, where you've seen young people turn away from Liberals and the political left broadly, has been really those concerns about affordability. I know it's a political issue in the U.S., but I think it's, well, up until Trump upended the political landscape here a couple months ago, it was like the dominant political issue in Canada. The cost of food, the cost of living, and especially just the cost.
Let me interrupt. Like, we watch the HD TV shows. That's like our access to Canadian culture is the Property Brothers. And you see the house prices, and they're like $1 million for what we would pay for 300 or 400.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm just, I mean, maybe that's not like $1 million and our money's not the same, but it seems really crazy expensive for some of these houses that get bought.
Oh, yeah, absolutely it is. And that's why it's become such an issue, and especially for young people, because if you're, so you're someone who already, so to give you a bit of background, over the past 10 years, especially, and maybe the past 20 years, there's been a huge explosion in housing prices in Canada. And the reason for that is just there's been restrictions on development, so you haven't been able to build enough houses to keep up with population growth. A lot of that's just been complex. A lot of that has been rules limiting densification, just regulatory processes that just take a long time and delay investment. There's also been in some municipalities, really heavy taxes on new housing development. And that's really become an issue for young Canadians, because if you're an older Canadian who already owned a home, you got all the benefit of that property value going up. Whereas younger Canadians are having a really hard time getting into the housing market and meeting traditional milestones of, like, buying a home, establishing a family with your partner in that home. And that's causing a lot of political concern against young people. And that's what a lot of that dissatisfaction against center-left parties, I think, has come out of. There's a real desire for deregulation in the housing market. And I think for a focus on getting rid of government barriers and focusing on economic growth generally among young people, that's not always common. And I think the main driver for that in Canada has just been affordability is such a big political issue.
Yeah, and it seems all government like these tariffs, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you go from yesterday to today, and a cell phone is $20 more expensive. Like, literally just because of the stroke of a government pen. So how does that play out in like this Ontario election? Tell us a little bit about the election, what happened, and what lessons we can take.
Yeah, so a couple months ago, this was back in February, you have the province of Ontario has its election campaign. So it's the campaign for electing the Parliament of Ontario, which then has the premier. It's like if for Americans who aren't familiar with how Canada's political system works, is we don't have like a separate legislature and an executive. The person who becomes the premier, which is the equivalent of a governor, is the leader of the largest party in the local parliament most of the time.
Okay, got it.
General.
So in each province, so you have how many provinces, and then in each province you have a government, like we have a state government.
Yeah.
And then did those individuals participate in the National Assembly, or is that a separate body?
No, yeah, the National Assembly is separate.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have 10 provinces, you have 3 territories in the Arctic that have their own governance system, which we don't need to get into. And then
like
you have the national
get
campaign.
together. Right.
And then you have the national parliament, which works the same as all the provincial parliaments.
Got it. Okay. And so back to Ontario, what happened in here?
So in Ontario, there's so in Ontario, there's an election. There's 3 main political parties in Ontario. There's the progressive conservatives, which are really just the conservatives. For historical reasons, they're progressive in their name. Then you have the Liberals, which are the center-left party, the NDP, which are the harder left party. The progressive conservatives had a majority government going into the election. They finished the election with a majority government, basically the same number of seats, not a big change in the result. And what you saw was the Liberals and the NDP really focusing on trying to win over young people, because that's often what parties to the left do, and not succeed in. A little bit of that was even the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has been able to get in on that anti-Trump stuff, present himself as like Captain Ontario, protecting local jobs. Another part, though, and this is what I highlighted in my article, is that what the Liberals and NDP were promising didn't resonate with the issues that matter to young people in Ontario. And the 2 big problems you have in Ontario are the affordability of housing. It's a problem across Canada that's really severe in Ontario, especially near the city of Toronto. And economic growth. Canada has had, over the past 10 years, essentially a lost decade of productivity. The amount that we produce for every hour that a Canadian works has essentially stayed the same over the past 10 years. Whereas in the United States, you've still seen significant growth in that. So what you saw in that election was the NDP and the Liberals announced these really gimmicky promises trying to win over young voters. They announced new tuition subsidies, which in my view were not necessary. We actually already have a pretty generous tuition subsidy program. There was no lack of opportunities for young people in Ontario to go to college and university. They did speak about housing, and I'll give them some credit. Some of the ideas they offered on housing were good ideas. They both promised to allow greater densification, which would help, but then they completely undercut their credibility by both announcing they would bring in these new rent control regulations, which in the short term can benefit the people who are already renting. But really, if you're capping the rent, you're cutting the return on housing, you're not building new housing. And that's what the problem is in Ontario, is we don't have enough housing.
Right. So, I mean, they're kind of promising free stuff, right? Like I thought young people love free stuff. You love your free healthcare up there, right? So where's it falling flat? Is it just that it's, and here's the crux of my question, okay? Are young people turning to free markets and understanding rules, regulations, overburdening is the problem, and they're becoming more conservative, libertarian, and understanding that to fix it, we can't have more government? Or is it that they're just bad at messaging it?
So I do think part of it is a turn towards free markets and understanding the effects of regulation. Unfortunately, it seems to be mostly limited to the housing market. So most young people in Canada, and I think most Canadians, are starting to realize that over-regulation on housing construction has had real negative effects on our economy, on affordability. There's been some recognition of, the effects of regulation elsewhere in the economy, though not as much as on housing. And I think it's not so much that people are turning against free stuff as much as just housing affordability has become such a big issue in Canada. That's the issue that drives voters. They realize that promising free stuff isn't the solution to housing, at least. So they're willing to turn that free stuff. If they have a party that promises they're going to do better on developing housing or doing better on growing the economy. I don't think it's necessarily it's not really been a rejection of center left ideas of free stuff of, what some people call woke politics. It really hasn't been Canadians turning against that so much as it's been Canadians being dissatisfied with what center left parties are offering on affordability issues.
Yeah, you mentioned something else in here with the tuition relief, because that has been very popular here. I mean, I know people personally that have benefited from student loan forgiveness, but it wasn't necessarily that they were doing it, but just that there's too many post-secondary grads already. Yeah, so talk a little bit about the tuition relief and why that didn't work.
Yeah. So I guess the argument would be, if you were going to make an argument in favor of tuition subsidies for economic growth, it really requires two things. One, that you're getting people enrolled in school who wouldn't otherwise have been enrolled in school. And two, that when they get enrolled in school, they're developing skills that are going to make them more productive. And in the current landscape in Ontario, and I think across Canada, neither of those are really true. First, because we just generally in Canada have a pretty generous system of tuition subsidies. There really isn't. There's been research done on it. There's really not a lot of Canadians who can't go to college or university for financial reasons. There's definitely people who it's a bigger financial burden to repay loans, but there are not people who are prevented from enrolling and getting the education they need for financial reasons. And the second thing is, and I think this is true in the United States as well, you've seen a lot of credential inflation in Canada. So that's the trend of like a job that used to not require a post-secondary degree, and you don't really need a post-secondary degree to be able to do the job capably, but now employers are demanding a post-secondary degree because they can. So you've seen a lot of that in Canada and in Ontario, and you now have a large number of working class Canadians who have post-secondary degrees that they don't need. I think there's been some research that about half of the current working class Canadians in jobs that don't require post-secondary degrees have some level of post-secondary education. So we really don't have a shortage of highly educated Canadians. That's not what's holding back economic growth. Now, you can make an argument that there might be certain fields where you lack it, but broadly, it's not an issue.
All right, so let's jump back to housing real quick. You're critical of rent control. Why does rent control not work?
Yeah, so why does rent control not work? So the reason it doesn't work is because what you want to do to improve the affordability of housing is you want to get more housing built, especially if you're in an environment where you have a shortage of housing like we have across Canada. What happens when you put rent control on is you're reducing the rent that, the land, the property company, the landlord can charge. When you can't make as much money off of the unit that you're building, it just doesn't make as much sense to invest in building new units, right? It's like comparing the benefit of the return you would get on the unit when you can rent it to the cost you would have to pay to build it. And in this environment where it costs a lot to build housing because of regulations, when you start putting in rent control, you're further reducing the amount of housing built. And even if you had, and even in an environment where rent control wasn't a huge limitation on housing supply and it was less of a severe issue, you would still have, if you had rent control, you're reducing the incentive for landlords to invest in improving the quality of units, making sure that they're meeting the demands of their tenants. So in most cases, it's reducing supply, which has a negative impact. It means fewer people can get housing. Even in those exceptional cases where you're not as much, there's still a negative effect on tenants.
All right. So what does a future, how do I word this? What kind of policies would you like to see rolled out that young people will be attracted to that will make a better long-term future for Canadians?
Yeah, so policy, yeah, and I'll talk about a mix of policies that could be federal or provincial. I think on housing, what you want to do is you really want to cut the level of regulations of what you could build. I would personally be in favor of maybe not abolish all zoning rules, but like if you zone an area as residential, let people build whatever sort of residential property they want, whatever like level of density you want, however high of a building you want. I'm fine with that. I get the benefit of maybe having a bit of zoning regulation of like you can't have an industrial facility right next to someone's house, but in general, you want to loosen those regulations as much as possible. I think you'd also want to have a broadly pro-economic growth agenda. One of the other issues I mentioned in that article is the fact that when Canada has poor productivity and that compounds over multiple years, that's lower in future wages and future incomes for young Canadians. So that would look like in Canada, something that's getting a lot of news right now is getting rid of trade barriers that are created by different regulations between provinces and that hold back local economic growth. It would be useful to continue to try and develop trade relations with other countries as the U.S. trade-in relationship is increasingly unreliable. This may not be politically popular, but I do think Canada would benefit from cutting corporate income taxes and income taxes on the highest personal earners, because it's been shown that that's a real barrier to getting highly skilled workers and getting business investment in Canada, and that's contributing to our poor productivity record. That's not yet become something that's politically popular, but I hope it would be.
Yeah, a business tax, a corporate tax is just double taxation because you're taking money that you paid taxes on in your paycheck and your payroll taxes, at least here in America. I don't know how your tax system works. And then you're purchasing a product that is also taxed, paid by the corporation. And so a corporate tax just decreases wages, increases prices, reduces investment in the company, and reduces amount of return to shareholders. It's a no-brainer, and that's a big reason. And I just did an episode on this recently where I talked about this. Trump had economic success in 2017 because of cutting that corporate rate. A lot of that investment came back, and people are going, okay, this is a little bit better, which is why the tariff thing is so crazy. Going from basically it was $30 billion in tariffs in 2018 when he put them on. This is like $300 billion. It's like 10 times larger, and it's just.
If I could just
go ahead.
You're 100% right about why corporate taxes are bad. The one thing I'd add is they're even worse in a small economy like Canada. Because the US is such a big economy, there's a lot of because you just have larger markets, you're not competing as much for trying to attract international investment. A lot of American investment comes from Americans. For a smaller open economy like Canada, where a lot of investment comes from abroad, having a corporate income tax is an even worse negative economic impact here.
Look at Ireland. I mean, Ireland is, so Eli Lilly's based here, and they build in Ireland all the time because of the low or no corporate tax rates that are in Ireland. And it just, to your, exactly what you just said, it's turned their economy around in a huge way. You know, and just some numbers like Canada, we have like 340 million people. You have 30 million people, 35 million people roughly. And I think if you were actually the 51st state, you would be second to last in terms of GDP. You know, only Mississippi would be below you in terms of GDP, which is like income to people, right? Roughly. So yeah, you guys are, that's always the healthcare discussion here. It's like socialized medicine can work in a country with 7 million people, 30 million people. It's a little bit harder when you've got the third largest country on earth. It's a little bit more unwieldy with some of these bigger socialized programs. All right, where can people find your work and follow what you're doing if they want to invade into the Canadian information space?
Yeah, the best place to follow me is on X, or formerly known as Twitter. That's where I talk about Canadian political issues. Sometimes jump in on American political debates. And whenever I publish an article, I always repost it there.
All right. Well, I try to avoid talking to Canadians, but you've been a great first guest, William. Thanks for all your information.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was fun.
All right, and thank you for joining me here on the program. If you learned something, take this, share it with your friends, send them a text and say, "Hey, I think I like Canada a little bit better," or "I feel sorry for these SOBs." Send it over to them and say, "Check this show out." That's the best way to help a podcast grow. And I thank you for listening to the Chris Spangle Show.